Welcome to Story Planet, where we bring you relaxing and peaceful tales to help you unwind. Tonight's story is The Cottage Tales. So settle in, get cozy, and let yourself be carried away into a world of deep forests, winding paths, flickering lanterns, and a secluded cottage where lost travelers find warmth, solace, and the stories that shape their journeys. Now let's begin. Deep within the heart of an ancient forest, hidden from maps and untouched by time, stood a small, weathered cottage. Its walls were strong, built of aged stone and timber, with ivy creeping up its sides as though nature itself had woven it into the land. The scent of earth, wood smoke, and wild herbs lingered in the air, and a narrow dirt path, barely discernible, twisted through the dense greenery, leading to its doorstep. Few ever found this place, and those who did never intended to. The old couple who lived there, Edwin and Eleanor, had made the cottage their home for as long as they could remember. They lived simply, in harmony with the rhythm of the forest. Edwin would gather wood, mend the roof when needed, and tend to their small vegetable garden nestled in the clearing behind the house. Eleanor, with her gentle hands, dried herbs, brewed teas, and prepared meals that carried the fragrance of the forest itself. They had no need for the outside world. For everything they required, the forest provided. It was said that only those who had lost their way, or perhaps themselves, ever found their doorstep. Travelers seeking something, rest, escape, or meaning, stumbled upon the cottage by chance, weary from the journey, their boots caked in the soil of roads unknown. And each time, Edwin and Eleanor welcomed them with open hearts, offering shelter, warmth, and the comfort of tea brewed with leaves from the land. One such evening, as the golden hues of dusk melted into the deep blue of night, a young woman emerged from the tangled trees, her steps unsteady, her face lined with exhaustion. The fading light had confused her path, and she had wandered, lost and unsure, until she saw the glow of a lantern in the distance. Hope rekindled in her chest, and she followed the light, drawing nearer to the welcoming warmth of the small house. She hesitated for only a moment before knocking lightly upon the wooden door. The sound was almost swallowed by the hush of the forest. Moments later, it creaked open, revealing Eleanor's kind face, her silver hair tucked into a loose braid, her eyes filled with gentle understanding. Behind her, Edwin stood, his presence solid and reassuring, the scent of pinewood and herbs surrounding him. "You must be tired," Eleanor said softly, stepping aside. "Come in, child. The night is long, and the forest is not kind to those who wander alone." Grateful beyond words, the woman nodded and stepped inside. The warmth of the room embraced her immediately. A fire crackled in the hearth, sending flickering shadows across the stone walls. Wooden shelves lined the space, filled with jars of dried herbs, well-worn books, and little trinkets that seemed to carry the weight of many stories. The woman took it all in, her breath slowing, her heartbeat settling into the quiet rhythm of the space. "What is your name, dear?" Eleanor asked as she poured steaming tea into an earthenware cup. "Alice," the woman replied, her voice soft but steady. "Alice," Eleanor repeated with a smile, handing her the tea. "You have found your way to us, just as so many before you have." Alice wrapped her fingers around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into her skin. She took a sip, the flavors of chamomile and mint unfolding gently on her tongue, soothing the weariness that clung to her bones. She looked up at her hosts, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "You said, many before me?" Edwin nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Aye, over the years we've had travelers pass through, each carrying a story, each leaving a piece of themselves behind. Some stayed a night, some longer, but all found something here that they did not even know they were searching for." Alice's curiosity deepened. She glanced at the fire, its glow mesmerizing, and then back at Edwin and Eleanor. "Tell me," she said, her voice laced with quiet wonder. Tell me about the travelers who have come before me. Eleanor chuckled softly, exchanging a knowing glance with Edwin. Very well, she murmured, settling into her chair. Let us begin with one of the first travelers who ever came to our door. And so, as the night settled over the forest, the stories of the lost travelers began to unfold, weaving the past into the present, their tales forever held within the walls of the hidden cottage. Alice sat back in the sturdy wooden chair, fingers curled around the warm cup of tea, its fragrant steam rising in delicate wisps. The glow of the fire played along the stone walls, flickering with a rhythm that felt almost alive. Outside, the whisper of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl wove seamlessly into the stillness. She had never known a place like this, a sanctuary hidden in the depths of a forest so thick that even the sky barely peeked through. Yet, within this cottage, warmth and a strange sense of belonging settled deep in her bones. Eleanor's hands worked deftly, pulling a shawl tighter around her shoulders as she settled beside the fire. So many have found their way here, Alice, she said, her voice as soft as the flickering light. Each with their own burden, their own longing. Some knew what they sought, and others only realized it once they arrived. Alice took a sip of her tea, feeling the herbal warmth seep into her. And you helped them all? Edwin chuckled, leaning back in his chair, his gnarled fingers resting against the arms of the chair. Not always in ways they expected, but yes, each one left here carrying something different than what they brought. Alice's curiosity bloomed. Tell me about the first traveler who came here, she said, settling in as she prepared to listen. Eleanor nodded, her eyes misted with old memories. Ah, the first one, she murmured, glancing at Edwin. It was many, many years ago, when we were still adjusting to life here. It was autumn, and the forest had begun its slow descent into gold and crimson. The air had a crispness to it, but it was not yet unfriendly. Edwin picked up where she left off. A young man stumbled upon our door just as twilight settled in. He was weary, his clothes torn from the brambles, his face streaked with dirt. At first, he didn't speak. He only stood there, his eyes hollow and lost, as if he had wandered through endless days without knowing where he was going. Alice felt herself drawn into the image, the weight of the story settling in the room. Did he say why he was here? Eleanor smiled faintly. Not at first. We took him in, gave him food and warmth just as we did with you. Slowly, his story unraveled. He had been a merchant's apprentice sent to deliver goods to a distant town. But something in him rebelled against the road he had been set upon. He did not want to be a merchant, did not want to carry ledgers and bartering words. Somewhere along the way, his feet turned against the path he was meant to follow, and he found himself lost in the forest. Alice leaned forward, captivated. Did he ever go back? Edwin exhaled a thoughtful breath. Not the way he came. He stayed here for a while, helping us, learning about the rhythms of this life. Then, one morning, he left with a clear purpose in his step. We never saw him again, but some years later, a traveler passing through told us of a man who had settled in a quiet village by the river, working as a craftsman, carving wood into things of beauty. Alice traced her finger along the rim of her cup, imagining the man, the choices he had made, the life he had found. He found where he belonged, she murmured. Eleanor nodded. As many do, this place, this forest, it has a way of helping those who are lost find their way, even if it's not the road they expected. Alice let the words settle in her heart, the fire crackling softly between them. A place unknown to the world, yet a refuge to those who needed it. And she, too, had stumbled upon it. Perhaps, like the others, she had come here for a reason she had yet to understand. She looked back at the old couple. Tell me another story. Eleanor smiled knowingly, her hands folding over her lap. Very well, my dear. Let us tell you about the traveler who came one summer night, searching for something he did not yet have the words to name. The night air was thick with the scent of earth and pine, the summer warmth lingering even as the moon cast a silver glow over the dense canopy. The forest never truly slept, rustling with unseen creatures and whispering leaves. In the quiet sanctuary of the cottage, Alice sat, her eyes fixed on Eleanor, waiting for the next story to unfold. Eleanor stirred her tea gently, watching the small ripples dance across the surface before glancing at Alice with a knowing smile. This was many summers ago, during the warmest season we had ever seen. The trees stretched their limbs lazily beneath the sun, and the air shimmered with the hum of insects. It was then that we met a traveler unlike any before. Alice leaned forward, entranced by Eleanor's voice, the cadence of a storyteller who had spun countless tales beneath this very roof. He arrived on foot, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he had been walking forever, Edwin interjected, his deep voice weaving seamlessly into the tale. A man with an old satchel, a hat tilted against the sun, and eyes that carried the weight of 1,000 miles. Alice listened intently. Did he know where he was going? Eleanor shook her head. Not in the way you'd think. He had been walking for days, led only by an ache he could not name. He was neither lost nor found, just drifting. His name was Samuel, and when he knocked on our door he asked for nothing but water. Edwin chuckled. Of course Eleanor wouldn't let him leave with just that. She insisted he stay, at least for the evening. And so he did, Eleanor continued, her voice softer now as if recalling the memory in perfect clarity. We gave him food, a place by the fire, and a quiet corner to rest. But that night, as the cicadas sang their songs and the fire crackled low, he sat here, right where you are now, Alice, and told us his story. Alice shifted in her seat, anticipation curling around her like a gentle mist. He had once been a writer, Eleanor revealed, a man of words and ink, filling pages with stories he wished were real. But one day, his words dried up. No matter how hard he tried, his pen would not move. His thoughts would not flow. He became restless, unable to sit still, unable to stay in one place. So he left his home, left the city behind, and simply walked. He told himself he would walk until he found the words again. Alice's fingers traced the rim of her cup. And did he? Edwin smiled. Not in the way he expected. Eleanor nodded. That night, as we talked, he found something else. Silence. Not the kind that weighs heavy on the soul, but the kind that soothes it. The forest, the fire, the stillness. He realized that his words had not left him. They had only been buried beneath the noise of the world he had left behind. Alice exhaled softly, the story settling deep within her. Did he stay? Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the window, where fireflies flickered like tiny lanterns in the dark. No, my dear. He left the next morning before the sun had fully risen, but he was different, lighter. He did not say where he would go, only that he was ready to write again. Alice smiled, her heart swelling with quiet wonder. It's strange, isn't it? How people come here not knowing what they need, and yet they find it. Edwin chuckled. Not so strange, really. The forest has its own way of speaking if one is willing to listen. Alice nodded, watching the fire ski, its embers glowing like scattered stars. Tell me another. Eleanor shared a look with Edwin before settling deeper into her chair. Very well. Let me tell you about the traveler who arrived on the coldest night of autumn, carrying nothing but a broken compass and an old melody in his heart. The fire crackled softly as Alice nestled into her chair, her eyes reflecting the amber glow of the flames. Outside, the wind whispered through the dense autumn foliage, sending golden leaves tumbling in slow, spiraling descents. The warmth of the cottage stood in sharp contrast to the crisp night beyond its walls, a haven untouched by the encroaching chill of the season. Eleanor's hands moved with practiced ease as she poured tea from a clay pot, the scent of cinnamon and dried apples filling the air. She took a steady sip before glancing at Alice, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The next traveler came on the coldest night of autumn, she began. He carried with him nothing but a broken compass and a melody trapped in his heart. Alice tilted her head slightly, intrigued. A melody? Edwin nodded, his deep voice rolling through the room like distant thunder. A song without words, a tune that lingered in his mind but had never been given a voice. Who was he? Alice asked, her fingers curling around her cup as she leaned forward slightly. A musician, Eleanor answered. Or at least he had been. His name was Elias, and he had once traveled from village to village, playing his violin in town squares and dimly lit taverns. Music had been his soul's language, his way of understanding the world. But one day, his melodies abandoned him. No matter how he moved his bow across the strings, the music felt hollow. The joy he once knew had faded, and so he wandered, searching for something he could not name. Alice's eyes softened. Did he find what he was looking for? Edwin exhaled thoughtfully. Not immediately. He arrived at our door shivering, his cloak damp from the mist and his boots worn from miles of wandering. He did not ask for shelter, only a place to sit for a while, a moment of stillness. Eleanor, of course, would not let him freeze on our doorstep. Eleanor chuckled. We gave him tea, much like this one, and a seat by the fire. He sat in silence for a long time, his fingers tracing the edges of his broken compass. I asked him where he was headed, and he only smiled sadly and said, I do not know. I only follow where my feet take me. Alice considered this, the weight of his words settling over her, and yet he found his way here. Eleanor nodded. Yes, that night, as the fire flickered and the wind howled beyond these walls, he spoke of the songs he had once played. I asked him if he had his violin, and he hesitated before admitting he had left it behind, convinced he would never need it again. But he still remembered his music? Alice asked. Edwin smiled. Ah, that was the magic of it. The music had never truly left him. It had only waited for the silence. That night, in the quiet of the cottage, Eleanor hummed an old tune from her childhood, one that her mother used to sing to her. And slowly, as if drawing from the depths of his memory, Elias began to hum along. The notes wove through the air like a thread, binding the past to the present. Alice felt a warmth spread through her chest, as though she too could hear the melody echoing through time. Did he stay? Eleanor's eyes glowed with the softness of recollection. Only for a little while. When he left, he carried with him more than a repaired compass. He carried his song once more. A month later, we heard from a passing merchant that a violinist had been seen playing in the streets of a distant town, his music rich with something it had once lost. Alice smiled, exhaling softly. He found his melody again. Edwin nodded. Sometimes one must step away from their music to hear it clearly again. The forest does not take away, it gives back in its own time. Alice traced the rim of her cup, the fire crackling gently beside her. Tell me another. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Edwin before settling deeper into her chair. Very well. This next traveler came with nothing but a single unread letter, sealed for years, waiting for the courage to open it. The air inside the cottage was thick with the scent of burning wood and dried lavender. The firelight danced along the rough stone walls, casting flickering shadows that stretched and curled like whispered secrets. Alice sat in quiet anticipation, her fingers warming against the clay cup in her hands. Outside, the forest murmured with the hushed rustling of unseen creatures, the wind barely stirring the dense canopy overhead. Eleanor folded her hands over her lap and sighed, her gaze drifting toward the window. This next traveler, she began, came not long after the musician had left. It was early autumn, when the leaves had just begun to turn, and the days still carried a lingering warmth. But he arrived here shivering, not from cold, but from the weight of something he had carried for far too long. Alice set her cup down gently. What was his name? Thomas, Edwin answered, his voice low. He was a quiet man, shoulders stooped, his steps hesitant. He carried with him nothing but a small satchel and a single letter, one he had never opened. Alice furrowed her brows. A letter? Eleanor nodded. He told us he had received it years ago, but he had never found the strength to read its words. He had carried it through seasons, across towns and cities, through years of uncertainty. It had grown soft at the edges, creased from where his fingers had traced over it, time and time again, but he could never bring himself to break the seal. Alice shivered slightly, though the room was warm. Why? Edwin sighed. He never said not at first. We let him rest, let him take in the quiet. Sometimes that's what people need most, space to hear their own thoughts. He stayed for a few days, tending to the garden, helping mend the woodpile before the first real chill of autumn set in. And every night, he would sit by the fire, the letter resting on his knee, untouched. Alice imagined the weight of it, the years of wondering, of fearing, of not knowing. Did he ever open it? Eleanor smiled softly. Yes, on the third night after supper, he finally asked for a knife. He held the letter between trembling fingers, hesitated for a long moment, and then sliced it open. He unfolded the paper slowly, as though afraid the words might vanish before his eyes. We did not ask what it said. Edwin leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. But we saw it in his face. Whatever was written there, it did not bring him sorrow, only relief. He exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for years. And then he laughed, a quiet, almost disbelieving sound. He sat there for a long while, staring at the words, and then finally he folded it back up and tucked it away. Alice's heart ached with curiosity. Did he tell you what it said? Eleanor shook her head. No, but we didn't need to know. Whatever had been locked away in that envelope had freed him the moment he read it. And the next morning, he left. Lighter, as though he had been walking under a great shadow for years and had finally stepped into the light. Alice exhaled, letting the story settle in her bones. It's strange, isn't it? How something as small as a letter can hold a person captive for so long. Edwin nodded. Sometimes, the weight of unspoken words is heavier than anything else a person can carry. Alice traced a circle on the wooden table, lost in thought. Where do you think he went? Eleanor's eyes twinkled. Wherever his heart needed him to go, and that, my dear, is all that truly matters. Alice let the fire's warmth seep into her skin, the story settling into the quiet corners of her mind. After a moment, she looked up. Tell me another. Edwin chuckled. All right. This next one is about a woman who arrived on the brink of winter, carrying a locket she had never dared to open. The evening had settled into a hush, the forest outside a quiet mass of darkened trees. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting a golden glow on the faces of Eleanor and Edwin as they sat in their chairs, their hands wrapped around cups of tea. Alice, curled up in her seat, let out a slow breath, waiting for the next tale to unfold. Eleanor glanced at Edwin before she began. She arrived just as winter's breath first touched the land. The wind had a sharpness to it, the trees losing their last golden leaves, their bare branches stretching toward the sky like silent sentinels. Edwin nodded. It was late in the evening when we heard the knock, a soft, hesitant sound, almost as if she wasn't sure she wanted to be heard. When I opened the door, there she stood, wrapped in a heavy cloak, her boots dusted with frost. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with eyes that carried the weight of something long buried. Alice leaned in slightly. Did she say why she was here? Eleanor shook her head. Not at first. She was quiet, her words careful. We invited her in, gave her warm tea, just as we have done for you. She held the cup tightly, as though its warmth could soothe something deeper inside her. Edwin continued. As she sat by the fire, she reached beneath her cloak and pulled out a small silver locket. She held it for a long time, turning it over in her fingers, staring at it as if it might speak to her. Alice's eyes flickered to Eleanor's. Did she ever open it? Eleanor sighed softly. Not at first. She told us she had carried it for years, but she had never been able to bring herself to unlock it. It had belonged to her mother, who had passed away when she was just a child. The locket had been left to her in a small wooden box, but no note, no explanation. Only the tiny silver oval, sealed shut. Alice shivered, despite the fire's warmth. Did she know what was inside? Edwin shook his head. She feared what she might find. A letter, a photograph, something that might change the way she remembered her mother. She told us she had tried to open it many times, but her hands would shake, and she would put it away again. Eleanor's voice was soft. She stayed with us for 3 days. In that time, she helped me dry herbs, watched Edwin mend the fence, and walked the frost-covered path behind the cottage, always with that locket in her pocket. We never asked her to open it. We knew it had to be her choice. Alice's heart clenched. What made her finally do it? Edwin smiled slightly. On her last night here, the snow had started to fall. It was gentle at first, a soft dusting over the trees. She stood at the window, watching it, lost in thought. Then, without a word, she took the locket from her pocket, held it in her palm, and pressed her thumb against the tiny clasp. Alice barely breathed, and Eleanor's eyes gleamed. Inside was a photograph, an old faded image of her mother, standing in front of a small house, holding a baby in her arms. The baby was her, and beside them, a man stood, a man she had never seen before. Alice's brows furrowed. Her father? Eleanor nodded. She had never known him. Her mother had never spoken of him. But there he was, in the locket she had feared for so long. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers tracing the faces, as though trying to pull them from memory. Alice swallowed the lump in her throat. Did she find out who he was? Edwin's voice was gentle. She left the next morning, but before she did, she told us that she finally had the courage to search. That, for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the truth. Alice let out a slow breath, staring into the fire. It's strange how something so small can carry so much weight. Eleanor smiled. Sometimes the things we fear most hold the key to what we need to move forward. Alice nodded slowly, letting the story settle in her chest. She looked back at the old couple, a quiet question in her gaze. And the next traveler? Edwin chuckled. Ah, now that one had a story of his own. He came with nothing but an old map, one that led nowhere. Or so he believed. The fire flickered low, its embers glowing softly in the dim room. The cottage, wrapped in the embrace of the dense forest, held the scent of pine and old books. Alice leaned forward, resting her chin against her hand, waiting for Eleanor's voice to carry the next tale. Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea before beginning. He arrived just as the last of autumn's leaves surrendered to the earth. The air had turned crisp, the wind a whispering reminder that winter was near. We first saw him from the window, a lone figure, hesitant at the edge of the clearing, as though debating whether to step forward or disappear into the trees. Edwin nodded. He was tall, with the air of someone who had been traveling too long. His coat was worn, his boots caked with dirt from distant roads, and in his hands, clutched tightly, was an old, crumpled map. Alice tilted her head. A map? To where? Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile. That was the question. He knocked on our door with uncertainty, as though unsure of whether he had reached his destination or was still wandering. When we welcomed him in, he barely spoke at first. He simply unfolded the map and laid it on the table, tracing the lines with his fingers as though trying to will them into meaning. Edwin's deep voice filled the space. He told us his name was William. He had been following that map for years, convinced it led to something important, something worth finding. But no matter how far he traveled, no town, no landmark, no road matched what was drawn. The places he sought either no longer existed or had never been there at all. Alice felt a chill run through her, though the fire was warm. Had he made the map himself? Eleanor shook her head. No, he had inherited it. It had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had once spoken of a hidden place, a sanctuary deep in the woods, a place where lost souls could find what they truly sought. William had followed it with nothing but his grandfather's words and his own desperate hope. Alice exhaled softly. Did he ever find what he was looking for? Edwin glanced at Eleanor before answering. Not in the way he expected. That night, after supper, we sat with him by the fire, and he spoke of all the places he had been. His journey had taken him across mountains, through valleys, across rivers, but still the map led nowhere. Yet as he spoke, we realized something. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her eyes gleaming. It was never about the destination. It was about the journey. He had spent years searching for something external, something mapped out in ink and paper, when all along, what he truly sought was peace within himself. Alice's heart clenched. Did he understand that? Edwin smiled. In time. That night, he slept with the map beside him, as though it were a talisman. The next morning, he looked at it one last time before folding it carefully and tucking it away. When he left, he no longer followed the path drawn on paper. He simply walked, trusting his own steps instead of an old sketch of places that may never have been. Alice stared into the fire, its glow hypnotic. Maybe some maps are meant to lead us back to ourselves. Eleanor nodded. That is the greatest journey of all. A comfortable silence filled the room before Alice spoke again. And the next traveler? Edwin chuckled, shaking his head. She came on a night when the wind howled through the trees, carrying a secret she had buried for years. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the cottage like a restless spirit searching for a way inside. Alice pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her fingers curling around the warm ceramic of her teacup. Eleanor sat across from her, her eyes distant, as if she were peering into the past, while Edwin stoked the fire, his face thoughtful. Eleanor finally spoke. She arrived in the dead of night, when the storm outside was at its fiercest. We heard the knock, soft, hesitant, barely there. Had the wind not lulled for just a moment, we might have missed it entirely. Edwin nodded. I opened the door to find her standing there, drenched from head to toe, her cloak clinging to her like a second skin. Her eyes darted around, wary, as if she expected someone to be following her, but there was no one. Just the trees, the wind, and the darkness. Alice leaned in. Who was she? Eleanor sighed. She told us her name was Margaret, but I suspected that wasn't the name she had always gone by. There was something about her, something guarded, as though she carried a story too painful to speak. We invited her in, offered her warmth, dry clothes, and a cup of tea, just as we have done for many before her. Edwin took over the tale. At first, she barely spoke. She stared into the fire as though it held the answer to whatever she was running from. But as the night stretched on, the silence between us grew softer, more welcoming. Eventually, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small wooden box. Alice's breath caught. What was inside? Eleanor's fingers traced the rim of her own cup. That was the mystery. She placed it on the table but did not open it. Not then. Instead, she told us how she had been traveling for weeks, staying nowhere longer than a night, avoiding the same roads, always looking over her shoulder. When I asked what she was running from, she hesitated, and then finally she whispered, a promise. Alice shivered, though the fire burned warm. A promise? Eleanor nodded. She had once loved a man, many years ago. They had made a promise to one another, to return to the place where they first met, no matter how much time had passed. But when the time came, she had not gone. Fear had held her back, fear of what she might find, or what she might not. And so she had carried the weight of that broken promise ever since. Alice's voice was barely above a whisper. And the box? Edwin smiled faintly. It contained a letter, one she had never opened. It had been given to her years before by someone who had seen the man she once loved, a letter that could hold the truth she had been running from all this time. Alice's heart pounded. Did she open it? Eleanor exhaled. Not right away. She stayed with us for 3 nights. During that time, she helped Edwin gather wood, helped me prepare herbs for winter storage. She listened to the quiet, let the stillness settle into her bones. And then, on the morning of the 3rd day, she sat at this very table, took a deep breath, and broke the seal. Alice hung on to every word. What did it say? Eleanor's expression softened. We never asked. But when she read it, tears slipped down her cheeks, and a smile, one filled with both sorrow and relief, spread across her face. Whatever truth she had been avoiding, it no longer held her captive. She left that afternoon, the letter folded neatly back inside the box, her steps lighter than when she first arrived. Alice let out a slow breath. Do you think she finally went to him? Edwin chuckled. Perhaps, or maybe she simply found the courage to move forward, whether he was waiting or not. Either way, she was no longer running. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, each of them lost in thought. Alice swirled the last of her tea in her cup, then looked up. Tell me another. Eleanor smiled knowingly. The next traveler. He came with nothing but a key, searching for a door he had never seen before. The fire burned low, its embers casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. The forest outside had settled into silence, save for the distant hoot of an owl and the soft rustling of leaves. Alice curled her fingers around her cup, listening as Eleanor's voice drifted through the warmth of the room. The night had a certain stillness, a hush that wrapped around the cottage, as if it too were listening. He arrived just as twilight surrendered to the deep blue of night, she began. His coat was frayed, his boots caked in the dust of countless miles, and in his palm he carried nothing but a small, rusted key. Alice leaned forward. Did he know what it unlocked? Edwin shook his head. That was the question that had driven him across towns, through valleys, and over endless hills. The key had been passed down to him by his grandfather, a man who had once spoken of a door, an important one, but no matter where he searched, the door was never found. Eleanor sighed, staring into the flickering firelight. By the time he arrived at our cottage, the search had become a burden. He had chased a mystery for so long that he no longer knew what he was truly seeking. Alice traced the rim of her cup. Did he ever find the door? Edwin smiled, but there was something knowing in his expression, not in the way he expected. That night, the traveler sat by the fire, the key resting on his knee, turning it over and over between his fingers. He seemed lost in thought, staring at its worn edges as if the metal itself might whisper its secrets. Maybe it never belonged to a real door, he murmured. Maybe I've been holding on to a dream. Eleanor reached for the kettle, pouring another cup of tea. The scent of chamomile and mint drifted through the air, soothing in its simplicity. Or maybe it was never about the door at all, she said gently. Maybe the key was only ever meant to remind you to keep searching. The traveler exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he had been carrying for far too long. His shoulders, which had remained hunched with the weight of his journey, finally loosened. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the exhaustion that had settled into his bones. Edwin watched him closely. Sometimes, the things we inherit are not meant to be solved like riddles. They are meant to guide us in ways we don't expect. The traveler nodded absently, running a thumb over the key's rough surface. He stayed only until morning, rising before the sun had fully touched the treetops. When he stepped outside, the world was still hushed in the last moments of dawn. He stood there for a long while, the key resting in his palm, feeling its cool weight one final time before slipping it into his pocket. He did not walk away quickly, nor did he seem to have a clear direction. But he walked with purpose, not in search of a locked door, but in search of something else, something that had always been just beyond his reach. Alice let out a soft breath, watching the fire's glow reflect in her tea. Some doors, she mused, are never meant to be found. Eleanor smiled knowingly. And some keys are meant to unlock more than just doors. Alice considered this, letting the words settle in her chest like a quiet truth. She could see the traveler in her mind, disappearing into the trees, carrying his key not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a reminder that not all searches needed an ending. Some journeys were meant to continue, leading not to doors, but to understanding. The fire crackled softly, and Alice, feeling the weight of the tale, looked at Eleanor and Edwin. "Tell me another," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Edwin chuckled. "Ah, the next traveler." She carried nothing but a notebook filled with stories that had never been written. The night was still, the embers in the fireplace glowing like the last whispers of forgotten tales. Outside, the forest breathed in slow yet steady rhythms, a presence as constant as the old cottage itself. Alice, wrapped in a knitted shawl, looked between Eleanor and Edwin, knowing this would be the last story before dawn arrived. Eleanor exhaled softly, a wistful smile on her lips. She came with nothing but a notebook, its pages filled with words that had never been spoken aloud. The ink was smudged in places, the spine well worn. We knew, the moment we saw her, that she had carried these stories for far too long. Edwin nodded. She arrived on an evening much like this one. There was a gentle rain falling, the kind that barely made a sound but lingered on the leaves. She stood at our doorstep, hesitant, unsure if she should knock. When she finally did, her voice was softer than the wind. Alice leaned forward. "Who was she?" "Her name was Isabel," Eleanor answered. "She was a writer, or at least she had once been. She had filled notebook after notebook with stories, but none had ever been shared. She told us she had come to the cottage in search of something, though she wasn't quite sure what." Edwin's eyes softened. "We gave her tea, let her sit by the fire. She held that notebook in her lap the entire evening, her fingers tracing the edges as though it held something fragile. We did not press her to speak, only waited, and slowly the silence gave way to words." Alice rested her chin on her hand. "What did she say?" Eleanor sighed. She spoke of the fear of being unheard, of stories meant to be told but kept hidden for fear they were not enough. Every page in that book carried a piece of her, but she had never been able to bring herself to share them with the world. Alice felt a pang in her chest. "So what happened?" Edwin smiled. "That night, she read one aloud. Just one. The words were hesitant at first, but as they filled the room, something in her changed. By the time she reached the final sentence, she was crying, not from sorrow, but from relief." Eleanor nodded. "She stayed with us for a week, reading a new story each evening by the fire, and with every word spoken, her hesitation lessened. By the time she left, she carried her notebook differently, no longer as a burden, but as something alive." Alice swallowed the lump in her throat. "Did she ever publish them?" Edwin's voice was warm. "A year later, a traveler brought us a book, a collection of stories by Isabel. Inside, there was a note, thanking us for listening when she needed it most." Silence stretched between them, thick with meaning. The fire crackled, the warmth wrapping around Alice like a memory she knew she would carry long after she left. She glanced at the old couple. "And what about you? Who listens to your stories?" Eleanor's smile deepened. "We tell them to those who need them, and when the time comes, they carry them forward." Alice let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She understood now. The stories were not just words, but echoes. Echoes of those who had passed through, leaving pieces of themselves behind. As the first light of dawn painted the sky, she whispered, "Thank you." Edwin and Eleanor exchanged a glance, then nodded. "You are always welcome here." And with that, the last story of the night settled into the quiet of the forest, waiting for the next traveler to find their way home. Thank you for joining us on Story Planet, where tales unfold to help you unwind. If you felt the warmth of the hidden cottage, the hush of the deep forest, and the quiet solace of weary travelers finding their way, consider giving a thumbs up. Share this heartfelt journey with your friends, family, and those who cherish peaceful stories. And don't forget to subscribe for more relaxing and comforting tales. Wishing you a restful night and sweet dreams.